War II. And I started to get an understanding that there was a real world out there with a lot of different countries. So I became very interested. I started collecting stamps, and I still have those stamps 70 years later. And I guess to be a collector, you have to have some genetic something in your genes that makes you want to collect. So I always wanted to collect because I had started when I was young, but I went through a long hiatus, a long period of time when I didn't collect. And I started collecting all the things you see here in the mid-1980s. 1984, 1985, I started falling in love with old books and art and all the other things. I don't know if Carol told you, but there's a lot of other things that I collect. Almost all of them have to do with history. I love the past. I love history, I love art, and I love things that tie those things together. Okay? Mm-hmm. Next one is, how and when did my interest in Napoleon start?
Yes.
Well, I'm old enough where I remember Napoleon. When the wars were going on, I was here. Does anybody believe that? No.
He's old,
Since
but
I
not
love
that
history, and Napoleon contributed so much to history, I started learning about Napoleon almost when I started collecting. Because I loved French stamps, and in French stamps, they devoted a lot of time to Napoleon because he was one of their great people. He was like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. The French talk about Napoleon. So I was very young, and I always had an interest in Napoleon, and Carol knows that even today in art, I think he's my #1 subject. That's why I just found a new painting when he was having a fight with the Pope. He didn't like the Pope, the guy who was Pope, the Catholic Pope at that time. Napoleon didn't like him. They had a lot of fights. So I just bought a painting that shows them fighting. So I've been interested in Napoleon a long, long time. Can I describe my collection? I don't have a big collection about Napoleon. I have a really good friend who lives in New Jersey, who's one of the great Napoleon collectors in the world. He has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces that celebrate Napoleon's life or that belong to Napoleon when he was alive. That's the centerpiece of his collection. He's a Napoleon collector, and there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people like that in the world. I'm a peripheral Napoleon collector because I love 18th and 19th century art and I love history. Napoleon and I come together in a lot of different ways. So my collection is not vast. We have some things that we call cheroot cases or cigar cases that were made in Napoleonic times. We have, as I said, we have a lot of clocks from the First Empire. Napoleon didn't make them, he didn't own them, but he owned the First Empire. So we have clocks, we have art, and we have a lot of other items. It's not, there are a lot larger Napoleon collections than mine, but I like to think that mine is one of the really good ones. Is anybody writing down my answers? You're recording them?
Yeah.
What is your extent? What is your extent on your? No, that wasn't written right. What is the extent of your knowledge about Napoleon? 1. How do you think Napoleon expressed his strong leadership throughout his life? For example, do you think that he showed his strong leadership through his war career? Yes. Napoleon was what we call a masterful general. He actually went to the battlefield, unlike so many other generals. He actually exposed himself to danger on the battlefield. And he made his men feel safe because they would turn and see the enemy, and then they would turn the other direction. There would be Napoleon standing. So it made him feel more confident on the battlefield. Now, I don't know if you know, I think Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general. Now, you can't do that in the American army now. I mean, you have to go through standard steps, you know, as you go up the ladder. So you very seldom see a general who's under 40, but you sometimes will. But he was 24 years old. And when he first started, he was he became a general despite all the things we talked about there. That he wasn't particularly good looking, or he wasn't ugly. That he was really small. And he had the kind of accent where people made fun of him. It's like when you meet somebody with a real bad foreign accent and you can't understand them, you know, the tendency is to say, what? Well, that's what people would say to him when they spoke in French. And so they made him a general because he came up with some really unbelievable plans about how to defeat the Austrians that they were fighting at the time. He came up with some plans that the generals thought were so unusual, they put him into effect. He was a captain. And they liked him so much, and they put it into effect, and they actually won that battle in one of the cities in France. And they promoted him on the spot to brigadier general. So he was a great leader. He did some stupid things because, like so many soldiers who were successful, they begin to think they're invincible. They think they can't lose. And the thing that he did, he was fighting essentially the whole world. The whole European world. You know, there was a whole different world going on in Asia. In fact, most of civilization was going on in Asia, you know, for a long, long time. But in Europe, that world was all involved in fighting Napoleon and the French. The British were fighting him, the Germans, the Austrians, the Italians, the Poles, the Russians, you name it. The Spanish, the Portuguese, everybody was fighting Napoleon at the same time, and Napoleon was beating everybody. So it was like they were so badly outmaneuvered that they all got together and formed what they call coalitions. All these other countries. So they had the first coalition, Napoleon beat him. They had the second coalition, Napoleon beat him. He kept beating him, and he thought that he could never lose. So he went to attack an enemy that he had never defeated. He went to attack the Russians. And he made a terrible mistake. He rode into Russia in the middle of the winter. And he couldn't get shelter for his troops. He couldn't get food for his troops. He had to leave. And he left behind a huge number of dead soldiers. So he lost that battle. And that's when his decline started. So he was a great leader, but he made some mistakes. How do you think Napoleon led his troops into battle and made him so successful in fighting? I told you, he was a hands-on general. You know, he would go with his soldiers. He would congratulate his soldiers when they did well. He would scream and yell at them when they did badly. Some people would even say that sometimes he shot his own soldiers when they did really badly. But we had a general like that in World War II that you should look into because he was very similar. His name was General Patton. General Patton was a hands-on general that never lost a battle. And he would ride with his men, just as Napoleon did. Napoleon was a new type of general, and he stayed with his troops, and he did a great job in leading them. How do you think Napoleon's action affected the rest of history? Enormously. Enormously. You know, one time, you guys gotta remember, I'm trying to remember, he loved his family. Napoleon loved his family. He had, I think, 8 brothers and sisters. I don't know if most people know that. He had an enormous family. And every time he would conquer territory, he would make one of his brothers king. So he had a brother who was king of Italy, then he wanted to make another brother king of Spain. But in effect what he did, he took over most of Europe and it all became part of France. So we had an expanded France at the beginning of the 19th century that was huge. Remember I told you inside that he had lost at this battle against the Austrians, the Battle of Leipzig? That was the Sixth Coalition that defeated him, and they offered him a peace treaty where he could keep some of his conquests, and he could keep Belgium, and he could keep Netherlands and parts of Switzerland, but he had just had to let all the other things go and promise that he would never attack anybody again. Napoleon refused to do that. So after the British defeated him, they not only exiled him, but they took away everything that France had ever conquered. And what they did is they changed the alliances in Europe. Europe became a different kind of place. And after Napoleon, there was never a country before Napoleon called Germany. They were a group of different little countries, like Prussia and Saxony. And after Napoleon, Napoleon gave the impetus by having so many enemies that these people all got together and started forming different countries. They formed Germany. Other people formed Italy from all the little countries. And so he had a tremendous influence on what we call ensuing alliances in the 19th century. I think Napoleon was the biggest mover and shaker of the first half of the 19th century in the world. So, pretty important guy. And that's why Napoleon is still famous today. Plus, he did all these things. He changed the form of government. He actually made government fairer to the people. And he actually put in place a system where people had a better chance at education, better chance of getting health care, better chance of doing well in life. So Napoleon, although some people would say he was a madman in terms of the way he fought wars, he was very good to the French people. He brought a lot of change to France, even though he never really thought of himself as being French. In fact, at some time of his life, he actually fought against the French and fought. It gets complicated, so forget about it. Corsica had a lot of different sections. Some didn't like the French, some liked it, and he actually fought against the French. What do you think of the legacy that Napoleon left affected the world today? I think that so much of what we have in this country, Napoleon had a tremendous influence. Now, I don't know if you guys know, and I don't know if you know, that when Napoleon finally was defeated at Waterloo, do you know what he wanted to do? When he realized when he was lost and he abdicated, he was still emperor when he lost, and they told him, if you don't abdicate, we'll kill you. So he abdicated. That means he gave up the throne. He gave up being emperor. And what did he want to do? He made plans to come to the United States. Napoleon's idea was, if he had to give up being emperor, he didn't want to stay there any longer. He wanted to come to the United States and start over, because so many French people had come here and felt that this was the most wonderful place in the world. They had an opportunity. You could bring into effect all those things that they were trying to achieve in France. So a tremendous legacy, and it's going to last longer than we will. What are some people to Knohl and Worley with poor strategic thinking when he only lost 6 battles out of 34 that he personally commanded? I think we talked a lot about that. He was a powerful, intelligent military leader. It's interesting because when he first started, he was not a ground officer. He handled the heavy equipment, like cannons and stuff like that. That's where his expertise was. But as time went by, he became a fighter, a ground man, cavalryman, riding on his horse. And he made some great decisions, but again, he got caught up in himself and began later in life to make really poor decisions. The interesting thing is the painting, you showed him the painting of Napoleon, not Napoleon, but Napoleon's troops in Spain. That was a separate war, you know. We call all the wars that Napoleon fought, and we call them, for simplicity,